It's an interesting day for India as President Putin finally has arrived in the country, and there's big news coming out of Delhi. India has signed a crucial deal to procure 5 S-400 air defense systems from Russia. The agreement was signed between Russian President Vladimir Putin and Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi in Delhi. The S-400 is known to be Russia's most advanced long-range surface-to-air missile defense system. The missiles include launchers, radars and command centers. The S-400 has target missiles and aircrafts that are as far as 400 kilometers away. The radars of this missile system can detect enemy aircraft and missiles that are within the range of 600 kilometers. The S-400 is manufactured by Almaz Ante and has been in service since 2007. China was the first foreign buyer to procure S-400s. In 2014, China signed a government-to-government deal with Russia. Moscow has already started delivering an undisclosed number of S-400 missile systems to Beijing. India is buying 5 of these missile systems at the cost of 39,000 crores. However, one needs to remember that the United States has imposed sanctions on China for its procurement of the S-400. India, on the other hand, hopes to get waiver on the US sanctions after pitching its need for S-400 as a requirement for national security. India and Russia have also signed a deal for space cooperation. An Indian monitoring station will be built near the Russian city of Novosibirsk. All right, so these visuals are the latest visuals coming in from the Hyderabad house in New Delhi, where you can see Prime Minister Narendra Modi is accompanied by Defence Minister Nirmala Sitharaman and Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj as they face Russian President Vladimir Putin. The foreign delegation level talks are now currently underway. Let's listen in to this meeting.
और प्रिविलेज देशों के लिए नहीं बल्कि हमारी स्पेशल और प्रिविलेज स्ट्रेटेजिक पार्टनरशिप में अपार संभावना है। भारत और रूस के संबंध संस्कृति से सुरक्षा तक और सभ्यता से समृद्धि तक हर क्षेत्र में फैले हुए। मुझे खुशी है कि हम दोनों देशों के 19वें वार्षिक हमने सुरक्षा और दूसरे स्ट्रेटेजिक मामलों पर हम परस्पर सहयोग के आर्थिक और दूसरे विषयों पर भी बातचीत करेंगे। एक बार फिर आपका और आपके डेलीगेशन का स्वागत करते हुए मैं चाहूंगा कि एक्सेलेंसी, मुझे ये जानकर खुशी है कि जोहानिसबर्ग में हमारी चर्चा के बाद और आपके सुझाव के आधार पर अब हम आज भारत और रूस के अग्रणी कारोबारियों का पहला बिजनेस समिट आयोजित कर रहे हैं। एक भारत में रूस का कुल निवेश लगभग 18 बिलियन अमेरिकी डॉलर से अधिक है। भारतीय कंपनियां अनुभव और तकनीक साझा करके रूस में ऊर्जा, स्वास्थ्य आदि क्षेत्रों में योगदान दे रही है। 23 वर्षों के दौरान 23 बिलियन डॉलर के सौदे के तहत रूस के एलएनजी की आपूर्ति शुरू हो गई है। यह दीर्घकालिक ऊर्जा करार भविष्य की संभावनाओं को दर्शाता है। यह परस्पर लाभकारी सौदा नए भारत की बढ़ती हुई ऊर्जा की आवश्यकता में मदद करेगा। यह भी हर्ष का विषय है कि गत 14 सितंबर को मॉस्को में इंटर गवर्नमेंटल कमीशन की बैठक हुई और उसमें हमारे सहयोग की समीक्षा की गई। हम लोगों को और बल मिलेगा। एक्सेलेंसी, स्ट्रैटेजिक इकोनॉमिक डायलॉग फोरम आयोजित करने के लिए भारत के नीति आयोग और रशियन फेडरेशन की मिनिस्ट्री ऑफ इस व्यवस्था की पहली बैठक इस प्रमुख बिजनेसमैन और रीजनल हेड्स को साथ लेने से ट्रेड बास्केट का विस्तार होगा, साथ ही सहयोग के नए अवसरों की पहचान संभव होगी। एक्सेलेंसी, हम काफी लेट कर रहे हैं, लेकिन फिर भी मैं कह सकता हूं कि जितना भी समय मिला एक प्रकार से बहुत ही क्वालिटी समय रहा हमारी बातचीत का और हमारे बीच अच्छा और उपयोगी विचार विमर्श हुआ है। इसके बाद हमको भोजन के लिए प्रस्थान करना है, वहां पर भी हमें आपसी बातचीत के लिए काफी विचार विमर्श का अवसर मिलेगा। मैं फिर एक बार आपका और आपके डेलीगेशन का स्वागत भी करता हूं और हृदयपूर्वक आपका बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद भी करता हूं।
So this is the 19th India-Russia summit, as you can see, which is currently underway at the Hyderabad House in New Delhi, where Prime Minister Modi and President Putin of Russia are finally holding the delegation-level talks. As we can see, Prime Minister Narendra Modi is accompanied by Defence Minister Nirmala Sitharaman and Foreign Minister Sushma Swaraj. And President Putin is accompanied by his delegation. And as we just heard, Prime Minister Narendra Modi mentioned that it's a multi-million-dollar deal that has been finally struck with Russia. He also welcomed President Putin, underlining how culture and history is something both India and Russia share for a very long time now. And this is indeed a very new beginning for India and Russia, as both the countries are inking the deal of the S-400. As we all know, the S-400 is the surface-to-air missile system.
Мы большое значение придаем нашему сотрудничеству в регионе, в гуманитарной сфере. Все это было и еще будет предметом нашего обсуждения, нашей сегодняшней совместной работы. Спасибо большое за внимание.
And this is the 19th India-Russia summit that is taking place. As you can see, that the delegation level talks are currently underway, and the signing of the MOUs has already taken place. And before that happens, now that the two leaders will be addressing a press conference, we will also bring in more details on this discussion, as I am joined in by former Ambassador to United States, Mr. Arun Singh, who is joining us live from London. Let's quickly go across to Mr. Singh. Mr. Singh, this is indeed a historic day for India and Russia ties, marking a new beginning thanks to the S-400, but also goes on to say how India has not really bowed down to the muscle-flexing tactics coming in from Washington.
Certainly, it's a very important meeting because, as you mentioned, this is the 19th annual summit. And the fact that the summit process started in 2001 has been maintained, has been sustained, is itself a reflection of the importance that both the countries attach to the relationship. In the background of that, the agreement that has been signed on the S-400, as reported, is again a reflection of the fact that on defense cooperation, Russia remains a very important partner for India. And that is continuing. Russia is able to share platforms and technologies with India that are not available elsewhere. And for India, it significantly enhances its capacities to defend itself. So that remains important. And the third dimension, I think through this agreement, there is an assertion that in its foreign policy decisions, in its decisions related also to Russia, India will be taking its own decisions based on its own strategic autonomy of decision making and not based on what any other country says. Because as has been discussed repeatedly, on the S-400, there is unfortunately a unilateral US legislation that makes such purchases sanctionable. And recently US has sanctioned China for purchasing S-400 from Russia. But India, through this action, has indicated clearly that actions, agreements, cooperation arrangements that it finds to be in its own interest, it will go ahead and take those decisions. And I believe that the US also, realizing the importance for India of the India-Russia relationship, and also realizing the importance of India for the US-India relationship, will find ways to look at giving a waiver for these purchases, which is also allowed under US legislation.
Right.
But as the Prime Minister...
Ambassador, you just mentioned the waiver, and ironically enough, I must mention that there's been no waiver for China, but there might be a likely waiver coming in for India. So do you think that it's highly unlikely that US might seek revenge on India in terms of trade wars that are currently undergoing? At the same time, Donald Trump had also labeled India as the tariff king.
So the two issues are different. First, if you look at China, the US relationship with China is of a different order, a different nature for the US relationship with India. US now sees China as a strategic competitor, and China is posing an economic, a technological, and a military challenge to the US, especially in the South China Sea, East China Sea. So in that context, US felt, including in terms of some of the differences with China on trade issues, felt that it was in a position to go ahead and sanction the Chinese entities involved in importing the S-400 from Russia without any impact on the US itself. Now, in terms of the relationship with India, US has been working to develop a new, strong, multidimensional relationship with India involving economic, technological, and also defense cooperation. And it sees India not as a challenge, as a threat, but it sees India as an important cooperative partner in terms of its own foreign policy interests. Therefore, if the US were to deal with India the way it dealt with China and go ahead and sanction Indian entities, then they would realize that in India, US would be seen as an unreliable partner. So if you're trying to build cooperation, that is not the path to go. So this is in terms of the strategic security defense dimension, which has been a positive story in the India-US relationship. On the economic side, as you mentioned, the story is somewhat different. There have been repeated sort of suggestions from the US that India needs to do more from their perspective in terms of enhancing market access, in terms of dealing with issues related to intellectual property. And President Trump himself has focused hugely on the trade surplus that India has with the United States, which is in the order of $30 billion. And our argument is that although we have a trade surplus with the US, overall we are a trade deficit country. But in terms of their own politics, they have focused on that. And in the agreements, discussions that are taking place, US is trying to explore as to how can it export more to India. So that's the context in which he made the references to tariff king. And there are some ongoing discussions between the two countries on trade-related issues.
Right. Ambassador, I'm also joined in by Fred Weir, who's the Russian affairs expert, who's joining us live from Moscow. Let me also go across to Fred and bring his views in on this discussion. Fred, Modi and Putin are also expected to review, apart from bilateral defense cooperation deals, discuss the oil and gas market in light of tighter sanctions on Iranian crude oil. How do you see the role of oil and energy in this entire picture?
I think this is a huge dimension, and it's got a lot of potential to grow. Russia is, as you've remarked several times, a giant country, and it is a cornucopia of raw materials. It has vast reserves of oil and gas remaining, and much of it unexploited, partly because there is a lack of infrastructure in the vastness of Siberia and Russia's north. So there are a lot of a lot of potential for Russia-India cooperation, not just in terms of trade, but in terms of developing the resources of Siberia. The Russian law has to change, Russian attitudes has to change. And this, I think, is one natural direction for India and Russia to develop if we're going to live in an open world where there isn't some new Cold War coming in. This is what I fear. We're hearing a lot of rational arguments about how it isn't in the American interest to sanction India and so on, and let's hope so. But we are not seeing a lot of rationality coming out of Washington these days. There seems to be an ideology in place that the United States has to assert its will, especially against countries like Russia and Iran, and anybody who gets in the way needs to be put in their place. This is not practical, rational thinking. There is an ideology, a unilateralist, America First ideology in place in Washington, and I wouldn't take anything for granted here. So there, but in the energy sector, and not only oil and gas, but nuclear energy, Russia has technologies that are, yeah.
Right. Fred, I'm also joined in by our principal correspondent, Siddhant Sibal, who's bringing us the latest from ground zero. Let's quickly also go across to Siddhant. Siddhant, you're there. The Russian president is also accompanied by a high-level delegation comprising of the Deputy Prime Minister and the Foreign Minister, Sergei Lavrov. What is the latest over there, and when can we expect the press conference to actually take place?
Well, the press statements were to begin at 1:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time, but it has been delayed. The lunch just started, and of course, this room where all the press statements takes place, it's a packed room today. It's a rare thing to happen, and there are a lot of media personnel present from the Indian side as well as from the Russian side. A lot of Russian journalists present, but of course, focus on many things on bilateral engagements, and of course, the top priority remains the S-400 deal, a deal which will of course give India edge in its security and defense architecture, especially in case of two-front war when it comes to Pakistan and China. But other than that, India has a long and time-tested relationship with Russia dating back to the Soviet era, and India has a positive image of Russia, so that of course works well here in India. And other than that, there are of course many pacts that will be signed, including one on space.
All right, Siddhant, we will continue to track the latest, and we will keep coming back to you as and when the developments take place. For now, let me also go back to Fred Weir, who's joined us live from Moscow. Fred, we were having this discussion about how India and Russia's relationship goes back to many years, especially when it comes to, the area of space. India and Russia space collaboration dates back to 4 decades, in fact, and India and Russia are likely to collaborate on the Gaganyaan mission also. So talk about how, India and Russia's collaborative efforts not only, they go beyond the defense partnership, they also span from the areas of, say, energy going across to space.
Yes, and this is, as everyone is saying, a long-standing relationship. There are, I have so many friends in India who were educated here in Russia, who've lived here for long periods of time. The integration, at certain levels between Russia and India is an extraordinary thing. I'm a Canadian. I can count on the fingers of one hand the number of Canadians who've lived in Russia for a long period of time, but there are hundreds of Indians. It is a really deep relationship, and it has these roots. Obviously, it's got to change. The world is changing, and India is just flowering as a modern, dynamic country, and it's going to reach out in a lot of directions. And the Russians, I think, have to get used to the idea that there are opportunities in the United States, in Wall Street, in Silicon Valley, and Hollywood, where Indians are coming in and being successful. And Russia can't offer any of those dimensions to Indians. But there are things, as you say, the energy sector, the defense sector, of course, where Russia will do things like lease India nuclear-powered submarines. You won't get that from the Americans. And there are things like space. With Russia's space program, even though it's greatly scaled down from Soviet times, it's still a major player in the spacefaring, enterprise. And India, again, how much access will the Americans give Indians into NASA, into its space program? Russia will. And so this is an avenue that India can and should pursue. There are probably many more things like that where there are synergies between Russia and India, and they should be explored. I think that's the message that Putin is bringing. But of course, you have these dark clouds on the horizon, and people saying you got to choose a side again, as it was in the Cold War, even though it's a far more complicated world than it was in those days.
Absolutely, Fred very rightly said that, this is indeed a very dark situation where the countries are being forced to choose sides, especially at a time when there are a host of accusations being leveled against Russia, from cyber attacks to, say, chemical poisoning. How do you view Russia's position at the moment in terms of the global picture when it comes to countries like US, UK, Canada and Netherlands actually ganging up against Russia?
We are in this situation. I can't remember it being this bad, even in the depths of the Cold War. These accusations are coordinated. They are intense, and I don't know what truth there is in them, but they are certainly being hyped in ways that never happened before. Russia is being demonized. I don't think that's an exaggeration. Putin is being demonized in the West, and Russians.
All right,
also.
Fred, I'm just quickly going to rope in Ambassador Arun Singh on that point that you said that Russia is being demonized and Putin is being demonized. Ambassador, your take on that?
As Fred mentioned, that there are challenges, but the situation is certainly very complex. In the US, there is a lot of domestic politics playing out because the perception in the US of Russia having intervened in some way in the electoral process in 2016. The Democrats and in the Congress, there's a lot of pressure, move to have some action taken, some sanctions against Russia, and they brought in the legislation. But again, as reports have pointed out, President Trump himself has not been very keen in terms of adding to the negativity in the relationship with Russia. And from time to time, he has tried to tone that down, as was reflected when he met President Putin recently. And his own press conference, along with President Putin, generated a lot of controversy in the US because he was seen as being very soft on Russia and in terms of the relationship with President Putin. So there are differences of opinion, there are complexities. Similarly in Europe, in parts of Europe, they feel some anxiety related to the action that Russia took in its own interest related to Crimea. But even there, the French leaders, the German leaders have reached out to Russia. They have a process of discussions going on. There is a Minsk process involving them, Russia and Ukraine, to deal with the situation in Ukraine, in Crimea. Several countries in Europe want to have a more cooperative relationship with Russia. Today you have Austria talking in those terms, you have Greece, and at the same time there are some of the Eastern European countries bordering Russia, such as Poland, who call for very strong and strident actions against Russia. So it's a complicated picture, and there are voices calling for more cooperative relationship, there are voices calling for retaliatory action, pushback,
right.
And that's the nature of politics, and we all have to weave our way through these conflicting pulls, pressures and demands.
But when it comes to India, India certainly learnt the art of coexistence, which is why the deal has finally been inked between India and Russia as far as the S-400 goes. Thank you so much, Ambassador Singh.